I'm Derek McGinty. You're listening to You Don't Hear That Every Day podcast. And this time around, we are joined by Cat Bohannon. She's a researcher with a PhD from Columbia, but more interestingly, she has written a book that may well change how you think about humanity, in particular, the female half of humanity. The book is called Eve, How the Female Body Drove 200 Million Years of Human Evolution. And Cat Bohannon argues in the book that the hero of the human story is not the caveman, but the cave woman. She calls her Eve, who has barely been studied or even talked about much for reasons we'll get into. Cat Bohannon, thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having me on.
It's great to see you. You were inspired, at least according to what you write, in part by something you ran into doing your research called the male norm. I had never heard of this. Please explain.
I also had never heard of this. So here I am doing a PhD, interdisciplinary PhD at Columbia University, right? And they gave me all the rope to hang myself. So I get to hang out in a lot of different departments. It's kind of cool. So here I am, and I am drinking, as you do, with a bunch of neuroscience postdocs. Okay, we're in an unfinished lab because some rich guy just donated a bunch of money to the university. And so now we get to build a new building. That's kind of how it works, actually. And even in the sciences, a rich guy feels a thing and suddenly you get a lab. Anyway, so here we are in this unfinished lab. We're passing a bottle around. A friend of mine, he's a neuroscience postdoc in a Nobel laureate's lab, actually. And I can't say which for obvious reasons. So he had just presented his work to his boss, effectively, the head of the lab, this Nobel laureate, as you do in almost any industry, right? You're like, here's my work, here's my shiny new graphs and findings, please don't fire me, here's what I want to do next, yeah? So the question they'd been pursuing didn't turn out to be that scientifically interesting. Like the data was kind of, but because he happened to be collaborating with a mouse lab that had a bunch of both sexes, male and female rats, I think it was, he actually had a lot of data for sex differences. And the differences in this question they were trying to ask about how the brain was working in rats, really, really interesting between the sexes. So he's like, here's my shiny graph, here's my thing. Hey, Nobel laureate, don't fire me, but also can we do this thing that we weren't planning to do? You know, and the guy leans back, his boss, and says, I think it's an artifact. You know, I just don't think it's that interesting. Now, what that means in the sciences is I think there's something wrong with your data, either how you analyzed it or how you set up your experiment. You did something wrong, in other words. Go do it again. So my friend, passing the bottle around this unfinished lab as we were, was like, no, I did it 3 times because I knew he was going to do that. I knew it was going to be like that. And look at my sexy data. Look at these graphs. They're so significant, statistically significant. And again, his boss was like, I just don't think it's the most interesting story here. Let's go back to our original question. So my friend, now heavily into drinking, says to me, this is going to have to be a side gig. The clearly most interesting question available to me as a scientist right now, which is the sex differences here in the neurons in these rat brains, is something I'm going to have to do on the side so that I can keep my boss happy to do the thing that he wanted to do. Now, this friend of mine, totally straight white guy. This isn't about an identity thing. This is just a scientist trying to do a thing, stumbled across it. And here's what I learned in this moment, because I, you see, had never worked with rats. I worked in humanities stuff and in psychology, where there are loads of male and female subjects in your experiments. But in most of biology, there's the male norm. In most of biology, you're actually only studying male bodies in almost any species that you look at, whether it's rat and mouse, whether it's up to dog, monkey, and all too often even in human studies for things like the kinds of drugs you might end up taking to see what their efficacy might be. We have, for about half a century, only been studying males. The reason for it, which again, I had to learn in this moment over a bottle, okay? Because remember, I have ovaries, so this is a very sinking feeling. This is a concern, because I'm starting to realize, oh my God, the majority of the medicines that I have taken, in fact, have never been studied on female bodies. Or maybe if they have been, but inappropriately, right.
Is it just sexism, or is it more to it?
Actually, no. Well, okay, there's sexism. I'm not saying there's not sexism. It's like saying, is there racism? Yes. Yes, the world is bigoted and terrible. But in this case, not only in this case, that's not what's driving it. In this case, it's like a philosophical problem. There was this thought that, okay, In humans and other mammals, there's such a thing as an estrous cycle. You and I might call it a menstrual cycle, how we get our periods. But in the rest of the body, besides just the uterus, there's this big wave of hormones that goes up and down over a cycle. But that's true in every species of mammal that happens to have ovaries, right? That has this estrous cycle. And the thing is almost every tissue in our bodies has sex hormone receptors, which do different stuff. They do different stuff in your like colon than they do in your heart, than they do elsewhere, but they're having influence throughout your body. So if you're a scientist, you're trying to set up your experiment, you want to understand what you're seeing. You want to make it as controlled as possible, right? You want to have those numbers be meaningful, and that's what's called controlling for your confounds. So if you're going to do that, well, one way to get rid of the confound of the estrous cycle is to just not study bodies that have them and say, well, male bodies don't have them, so we cool, right? No, turns out no, not cool at all, actually. But that was generally the model for like half a century. I'm not saying there's not sexism. I'm saying that's just not why this decision was made. There was no cabal of evildoers,
Right.
a bunch of guys in a boardroom saying, haha, we're going to make lives suck for people with ovaries. No. It was just like, here's an easy way to control for it. But it turns out, actually, sex differences influence us like all the way down to our
Yeah, that
cells.
was the thing. In your book, you say, wherever you look, the sexes are different.
Just about, although not always in the way you would think. We always focus on the stuff we can see because we're a very visual species, right? We're like, oh, the boobs thing must matter. Oh, maybe there's behavioral stuff around culture, which we forget is very recent and local and very diverse across the planet. But, and we say, oh, that must be the deep sex difference. Actually, some of the deepest sex differences are about the immune system. Some of the deepest sex differences are in your cardiovascular system and whether or not it's hard to literally be male over the course of a lifetime on one's heart and one's arteries. Turns out in most mammals, yeah, actually. And we need to figure that out.
Yeah, you say in the book that we men would all live longer, basically, if you cut our testicles off.
Well, I said that on the Daily Show. I don't think I mentioned the testicles in the book. There was a lot to cover in the book. But no, it is true. It is true. And I can tell you, across mammals, one of the surest ways to extend male lifespan is to castrate them, cut off his balls. That's true of rodents. That's true of dogs. Like if you have a pet dog.
So why is it true?
We don't entirely know. And it's really important when we're talking about science in public space to say what we do and we don't know, right? We don't entirely know what's driving it. We just know that it's true in just about all mammalian species. Now, it seems to be slightly more effective if you do it before that species puberty, which is again, not something I recommend you do at home. This is not like a good idea. Okay, let's not like go seeking some solutions. But it is true that for a domestic dog, if you have a pet dog, it adds an average of 1.5 years to that dog's lifespan. Doesn't sound like a lot, but remember that dogs don't live very long. That's like a big percentage. For a human animal, people like you and me, if you happen to be a body that has testicles, well, having them removed does seem to extend your life by an average of 14 years. Now, I know it's not small. That is not a small number,
but still not worth it.
Still not worth it. And one of the things that's troubling and interesting about it is this is a common treatment, or was for a long time, for people who have prostate cancer, people who have testicular cancer, certainly. In other words, it's a thing that has been in the medical space, is considered and done over time. But the thing is once you already have cancer, it turns out the gains aren't so great. That 14-year thing, that is usually for historical data, people who had them removed for other reasons that weren't because you had the cancer, right? So really what would be great is figuring out how to get those gains without you getting cancer. That's what we're really trying to look for here.
Yeah. Well, let's go to the other side and talk a little bit more about Eve, because you said something that I thought was fascinating. And I'm going to quote from your book. Species don't really get a harder problem than the one we have to deal with. We're really, really bad at reproducing ourselves, demonstrably worse at it than many other mammals. We're worse than most other primates. Now, end of quote. People like to talk about the miracle of birth. You're saying it's a miracle that it ever happens at all.
Look, My children are miraculous and terrible for all the reasons they are both, because they are children. I have a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old. Love them, wouldn't trade them for the world. Would have liked birth to suck less. We'll put that out there as like a thing. I can support other people who have positive experiences and say, good for you. Good for you, you and your happy birth story. The rest of us, though, okay? But the thing is, and this is true across the human body, this is true across human culture, just because something is normal doesn't mean it's okay. Birth effectively sucks for all human people that give birth, all women that give birth, right? But it doesn't suck as much for other primates. It doesn't suck as much for, well, most others, except for squirrel monkeys, and we're sad for them. But like most other mammals aren't like this. And there are a few different reasons that's true, but simply at the start of it, admitting that that's true is useful, not just socially, but scientifically. That's true also.
So, but there's 8 billion of us on this planet. So, and up until recently, we didn't have very much technology. So, I guess my point is we're pretty good at it. I mean, aren't we?
Well, by which measure? So it's
Mm,
hard to say that our reproductive system is unsuccessful when you see so many measures of success, which are literally the babies that then have the babies have the babies. That's how evolution works, right? So it can't be
right.
so patently terrible except for all the suffering, right? But if you look at a
Right.
hyena who gives birth through a proto penis, her birth canal runs down the middle of, we won't get into details. Let's just say it's not great for her. Okay. She has a lot
Mm.
of androgen in her system. She develops genitals a little bit different than ours. Moving on. Anyway, there are lots of ways of giving birth in the animal kingdom that are not great for the body that's doing it. But if they make enough babies and it's advantageous enough, we shouldn't always assume evolution is going to give us something that we're going to like. It's just,
Mm.
is it selected for over deep time? We're talking millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, right?
Mm.
Now, the human reproductive system is terrible for a couple of reasons. And by many measures, it seems to have been terrible for many of our ancestors. Like 3.2 million years ago, Lucy, furry little Australopithecine, looked like a tiny little chick, somewhere between a chimp and a human, walked upright. Lucy, we love her. 3.2 million years ago, she had a midwife. The reason we assume she had a midwife is because her pelvis, like ours, didn't have a really great birth canal situation. It was narrower. We had something called an obstetric dilemma. There was something wrong with how big the opening was versus the size of the baby. Now, this is a controversial thing in evolutionary spaces. It's pretty widely accepted, but there is debate. We're not sure if that was the big deal. But the generally accepted story is that, well, our reproductive system probably got real bad about
Mm.
3.2 million years ago. And the way we got around it was the way we always get around stuff: behavior. We changed how we behaved. We changed the things that we did rather than waiting for our bodies, our physiology, to catch up. So we
So
helped
you.
each other give birth. That's what I'm saying. And that's the big
Mm.
reason there are 8 billion people on the planet right now, because behaviorally, we started intervening on what would otherwise be a catastrophic situation. And
So
not just
you.
at the moment of birth. That's the thing I say in the book, too. Not just at that moment you give birth, but actually that long period you're pregnant, your whole reproductive life before, and your whole postnatal recovery after. We started helping each other through a terrible process, which helped us survive and thrive and get
So
to
you're
8 billion.
saying the difference is between you or a woman, I should say, and you know our ancestors from a zillion years ago is gynecology.
Fundamentally, yeah, gynecology and obstetrics, but obstetrics, which is that thing that's specifically having to do with pregnancy and birth,
Sure,
that
sure.
all falls under that big umbrella of gynecology, which is intervening, providing medicine for the female reproductive system in our species. And we did a lot of things. Some of that was to make us more fertile. Some of it was to make us less fertile sometimes, actually, because remember, in any given environment, right, the thing about our species that's so cool and interesting is we are super adaptable. We can live just about anywhere. It's not just that we're 8 billion. We're not just 8 billion in Hong Kong. We're 8 billion everywhere. That's the point. We can live in so many different environments with so many different cultures and ways of being, ways of going about this thing that we do, including how we go about making babies, right? Well, if you think about ancient times, it may not have been advantageous to have the same kind of reproductive patterns. Maybe in some environments, it would have been better to have your babies kind of clustered together, like earlier on in life, and then just take care of these incredibly needy, terrible things. I love them again, but they can't even hold their head up when they come out. They need a lot
Sure.
of work, right? So, maybe you have a bunch of them and then, okay. Or maybe in other environments where food is more scarce, you space them out. You say, okay, I'm going to do this difficult thing now, but then I'm going to breastfeed and I'm going to carry this baby out to like age 3, 4, 5, and then have another, which by the way is what chimpanzees do. They average about 4 to 6 years between their births. And in many human hunter-gatherer species as well, today, species is wrong. Let me say that again. In many human hunter-gatherer groups, cultures that are alive today, you have wider birth spacing than you do in places like the United States of America.
Hmm. Much of your book is devoted to analyzing these sex differences that you talk about between men and women. And one of them is how men and women perceive the world. And I got to
Yeah,
ask you, you know where this is headed.
I
I
do.
got
I
to
do.
ask
Go
you
for it.
about your relative youth and an interesting modeling job that you once had.
Right. So in college, I was an art model. I was a nude model. I was a professional naked person. Now, it had a lot of the cultural trappings of privilege, of course, not simply my whiteness and all of that, but also it's very different to be a naked person in such an environment where they're doing painting versus all of the ways in the world you could be a stripper. Right. So
Right.
it wasn't for the sake of titillation necessarily. It was for the sake of them learning how to draw. But I was naked. I was up on a little raised stage, and I was nude, and I was holding a position, whatever, what that position might be for a certain amount of time. And then because it was the late 90s, they would all go out and have a cigarette. Which
Hmm.
I wouldn't recommend, but in the 90s they did, especially in art. And that meant I got to put on a robe and walk through the easels and see my body as they saw it and rendered it take form. Here a limb, here an arm, oh wait, all of the male students are drawing my boobs like 3 cup sizes too big. Like all of them. Like all of them, like Betty Boop, like not even like a cartoon. And it wasn't that it wasn't a stylized thing. I mean, it wasn't like they'd watched too much anime or something, or that they'd, been flipping through the porno mags. It wasn't that. It was like they didn't understand proportion in this one part of a body, right? And the
Hmm.
female students, for whatever reason, didn't have that problem. Now, these were both beginning art students. This whole class, mixed sex, it's not like anyone was a better artist than another measurably across the genders. Nothing like that, right? And it was about 50-50. By the 90s, it would have been, yeah. But for some reason, the females' boobs looked kind of like my boobs. I mean, they're not small, but they're like, they didn't look absurd, is what I'm saying. And the males, right? But then over the course of the semester, over those months, right, from the beginning of the class to the end, my boobs would shrink on the male canvases and go back to kind of normal boob size, right? They were just, it's like, and what was happening is they were learning how to draw what their eyes actually saw and not what their brains thought their eyes
Hmm.
had seen. And that was really, really interesting to me. And that was one of the first moments, and I was like 18, 19, where I was like, oh, do men live in a different perceptory world? Like, do they
Hmm.
have actually different eyeballs or brains or configurations somehow? What's up with them and my boobs? Because remember, not all these guys also were heterosexual. It's an
Right.
art class, dude. They were a range of sexualities, right? Who knows what was going on? I knew some of them, didn't know others. Like, so it wasn't just like an attraction thing. It was
So,
just,
that
yeah,
being the case, did
yeah.
you find out in your research as you moved along that we do live in two different worlds, sort of back to the old men are from Mars, women are from Venus kind of a thing?
Yes and no, and as usual with these things, not usually in the way you would quite expect. So, for example, you would think that the males in that class were fixated on my boobs for deep psychological reasons. You know what I mean? But it may actually have to do with just what male eyeballs tend to do in scanning a visual space. So, for example, famously in psychology, now we're a little back in my wheelhouse of science, right? Male subjects, guys, in your experiments, will be a little bit less good at remembering faces than females. Like if you show them a computer screen with lots of different faces and you ask them to recognize them over time, the males are slightly less good at it. Okay. Likewise, with emotional recognition, the males classically will be slightly less good at answering those questions. You show a computer screen of like faces, like anonymized faces with like surprised face or scared face or whatever. The guys are just slightly less good at accurately doing a thing. And the thought, of course, for a long time was like, oh, men are less emotional, men are less social, men are less. Actually, it may just have to do with where your eyes are going on a screen. So, for example, now that we have eye tracking studies, we have tiny little cameras that can track where your pupils are going. Because your pupils, even looking at me here in this like online camera situation, are actually doing this. They're kind of doing the saccades all over the place. They're dancing around in really subtle ways. Those are called saccades. So when your eyes stay fixed on the spot, that's called fixation. When they're dancing around, it's called saccades. And males tend to have slightly different patterns. So when you're looking at a face, stereotypically, I mean, given that you are male, you are more likely to focus kind of on the center of my nose, kind of like right there, kind of for whatever reason, your pupils they're moving around my face, but they tend to go right here for some reason. If you were female, again, this is on average statistically. In the sciences, we work with averages, right? It's not about saying what a thing necessarily is, it's what a thing is on average. The eyes move around more. They go between the eyes and the nose and different positions on the face more. They have different patterns, in other words, of fixation and movement than males, which may mean that female brains are just slightly better at noticing subtle differences between faces and subtle differences between expressions. Not because that brain is more emotionally fixated, not because that brain is, that stereotype, the women are from Venus thing, but just literally for whatever reason why your eyes are moving the way they are. And likely because literally things loom large in the mind when your eyes sticks on them, right? You're seeing a visual field right now. Your eyes are literally looking in the world. But the more you look at a thing, the bigger it literally seems in your frame, right? So if those males were literally fixated on my boobs more, it would have made them loom large against my body effectively until they trained themselves as artists to draw them smaller. Now, why they were fixated on my boobs might be social. It may be that they just don't have them and they're like, well, that's weird looking. We don't know. Maybe some of them were into them, but again, not all.
That's interesting. So when we talk about these sex differences, how did they play out in the development of humanity in that 200 million year period that you talk about? I mean, how did, and then you add to that the very difficult task of bearing children as you describe it. How did it make Eve's life a lot different than Adam's life?
Well, like I say in the book, the funny thing about evolution is we don't just have one Eve. We actually have millions, maybe billions in truth. Because if an Eve is a last common ancestor, if an Eve is a central mother, if you like, from which all life that eventually becomes us springs, well, in the evolutionary model over 200 million years, there's a lot of different birth and bodies that are passing down their genetic material that eventually, like we were nothing like human beings for the majority of that time. Majority of that time, we were squirrely little weasel bitches, as it were. We were just squirreling around the feet of dinosaurs for some time. Then there was an asteroid and boom, and then really just birds are left and they're kind of pissed about it. There's a lot of deep, deep change in the world going on when all of these Eves, these female ancestors, are going about their weird, often rodent-like lives, right? So it's a really long time before we're primates up in the trees. It's a really long time even after we're primates until we come down from the trees, many, many, many millions of years, right? But in all that time, there are like a few key Eves, a few key characters, a few key Edens too that they live in, their sacred gardens, that are shaping their bodies in certain ways, that are making us change to suit and to eventually, quite accidentally, well, this thing that we're sitting in now, which is kind of great and kind of absurd, which is the human body, right? One of the fundamental things that really drives a lot of that, though, in mammal are these reproductive changes, which is one of the weird things about why we hadn't been talking about the female in evolution. She was always kind of a side character in a lot of this public writing about humanity's story, where we came from in deep time, I guess she was like over the hill pounding some tubers or something. I don't know, which is weird because these are actually the bodies that make the babies, this is where evolution actually happens. This is the engine, as it were, that's building things out. I'm not saying that you don't matter. You matter massively so. I'm just saying that, if you want to look for where the bodies are building bodies, that's tends to be in mammals, at least in the womb.
Mm,
And since we have this thing in mammals where we're caretaking species, which is to say, the body that gives birth to the offspring, whether rodent all the way forward, early mammals forward, it also tends to be the one that breastfeeds, also tends to be the one that has this heavy caretaking for various ways across the lifespan until a certain point later on. So the relation then between that birthing body, between that female and the offspring and her environment is that much more important, is that much
mm,
more crucial for the success of the species. So that's one of the
sure.
reasons I really thought we should dig into how that story changes when we say, yeah, cool, 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 guys. I see you out there swinging your thing, but let's talk about the female for a minute.
Yeah. Do you think that women invented language?
I actually don't. I actually think it's more that, right. So, language, human language, is this really distinct thing, which seems to be only true of our species by most definitions, right? But remember that we don't come from nowhere. We didn't just like leap out of the head of Zeus. You know what I mean? But like we don't spring fully formed into the universe. We evolve from other bodies that are very similar and eventually bodies that were very dissimilar the further back in time you go. Well, that's going to be true of a lot of our behavior too, and a lot of our brain too. Our brains don't come from nowhere. Our communication patterns don't come from nowhere. So the moment of when language starts is actually really hard to pinpoint because we're going to have very primate like social communication patterns, and chimps do too, for an absurdly long time. And so, when along that path do you start saying, this is more human, this is less? When along that path? Well, probably when you arrive at grammar, which is to say, you and I are having this conversation with this shared language, but we, are able to combine our words in different ways with different grammatical rules, right, that are deeply flexible, such that we can say many different things with not too many words. Yeah,
Mm,
depending on the order of things and how we shape them, right? So that's very, very deeply unique of humanity. At some point that arrives. So that's a long way of leading up to your question, which is, do I think women invented language? No. I do think, however, that the female vocal instrument, the female hearing apparatus, and female patterns of communicating with our offspring have unique advantages that were probably necessary to help this whole language thing keep going. It's more like that.
gotcha.
Right, because my vocal tract, my lungs, and my ears for hearing are all slightly better at precise and up close communication. Not so much so that you're bad at it, not like that, just slight advantages, slightly better at up close precision, which is really good for this fine tuned, complicated human communication thing we call language. It's also true that our ears are, by our, I mean, typical female ears, are slightly better tuned to the range of pitches that correspond to baby cries, slightly higher pitched. You and I can both hear them. It's not that. I mean, it's like a tuning thing. Like if you had a mixing board, we're just slightly boosted, if you like, right around those pitches. That doesn't mean it's our destiny to hear them. It just means we evolved in ways that gave us better advantages for it, which, if you're a lactating body, is probably useful because you need to
Mm.
hear when the thing's crying if you need to go put a boob in its face.
Okay. I was struck by another passage in your book, and I'll quote: women are sexist. We think sexist stuff about other women. We do the sexist things in the world. We create sexist rules and strongly reinforce them. So the question is this: what possible motivation could we have to maintain a sexist culture that mostly disadvantages women? End of quote. Can you answer
Yeah.
that question, I guess?
I can answer it with kind of wrestling with it, which is what I do in the book, because of course, look, I have passed 40, which for a female person is apparently ancient. But I have well, not true actually statistically, but I mean culturally. Yes. I am now a dinosaur. But all throughout my apparently long, not very long life, I've been told that when women are sexist, it's because we have internalized sexism from men, which is to
Mm,
say, somehow it doesn't come from us. Somehow, whenever female people reinforce sexist rules that disadvantage women and girls. We're doing it because we've somehow taken in a message from someone else, taken in a rule from elsewhere, and kind of passively became the medium through which. Now, I always found that pretty patronizing. You know what I
Mm.
mean? That somehow implies that females being disadvantaged, being marginalized, somehow weren't participating in the culture. We were just kind of, I don't know, passively, doing. It's almost, it's like we didn't understand what we were doing. Do you know what I mean? It's like we were children or something. And I always found
Mm.
that kind of BS. But I wrestled with it. I struggled with it, as you do. But when I looked out at the science of the thing, and I thought, oh, no, 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 no. All human beings are massively social primates. We are deeply always culture makers and culture regulators. There's no way any member of any given culture isn't actively participating in and creating rules or resisting rules and trying to create new rules and just participating in this massive thing we call human cultural behavior. Yeah. And so if that's the case, then is there any advantage? Is there any history at the very least? Is there any story behind the reason why females might participate in these sex rules that might disadvantage women and girls? And so for me, I said, okay, advantage might be strong, benefit might be strong, but from a biological point of view, okay, let's put ourselves in a biological point of view.
Mm.
Our reproductive system is terrible. Okay, if that's our a priori, if that's our given, if we say that's the beginning, okay, then that means that we need to behaviorally innovate around that reproductive system. One side of that is gynecology, which is to say we do things, and midwifery, we do things to help us survive the process, right? Sometimes it's having sex less, sometimes it's providing innovations that boost our fertility. There are many things that we do to change reproductive outcomes, the gynecological side. Well, then there's also the sexist side, because the majority of rules that tend to disadvantage women and girls, social rules, tend to have to do with access to female bodies around sexuality. What
Mm.
part of this body can be seen in social settings? What part of this body can be touched in social settings? Whom are you allowed to interact with, right? And in what context and when and where, even before you get to the point of actual sex. Way before then, like who you get to talk to and what you get to say, right? Over the course in many, many different human cultures of a female's lifespan, there are deep, what I call in the book, sex rules. Yeah. Stuff that's effectively, again, from a biological, scientific point of view, shaping that person's reproductive destiny. Who does
You
she
know,
get to have sex with, and when does she get to have babies, and is she obliged?
that point is so interesting because I have often wondered how human history would have been changed if women could control when they ovulated and decide definitively whether they wanted to have children or not with a thought. It would have
Mm.
changed. I mean, how would things have been different?
Well, we would live in a magical universe and there'd be shit like wizards. Um, since there isn't, and we don't, unfortunately, what we have is the pill, which has great advantages and great disadvantages. We also have many different cultural innovations around this kind of stuff. Now, if you
Yeah.
can think of gynecology and this model of sexism, which is just strictly which is not about being treated badly in a boardroom, okay? Which is not about the fact that I put on makeup in a way that you are differently obliged as a person who doesn't present as a female person and choose to. You know what I mean? Like, not that kind of stuff, but like stuff that actually influences my fertility, right? The sex rules that regulate that kind of stuff. Well, they're two sides of the same coin, right? They're both things that in deep time may well have helped females survive and thrive in different environments. Now, every human culture on the planet that we know of creates these sex rules, man. They do. They create these sex rules. We have different ones. The Netherlands has very different rules from the United States of America, and the Netherlands has very different rules from South Korea, and South Korea obviously different than North Korea. There are many ways of being human, all of which are equally valid. I'm just saying that all of the ways of being human and creating culture tend to produce sex rules. And when we do create these rules, We feel really strongly about them. Would it have been different if we'd lived in a magical universe and could decide when to ovulate? Sure. Also, there'd be dragons. But, like, like, turns
All
out
right.
my brain can regulate my behavior, but it can't shape what my ovaries are doing without intervention.
Yeah, yeah,
Although
yeah.
stress is a factor, stress is a thing, but
I'm
that's like
curious,
imperfect.
how did you change in the researching and writing of this book? How did your ideas about women and men and our relationships to each other change in the writing of this book?
Oh man, probably in ways I'll be talking to my therapist about for decades. Like, there's a lot to unpack there because I am a person with a female body, a very obviously so, very feminine form that has been living in this body for so long and will continue to. And I have not yet hit menopause, so I'm going to have to deal with all that when that comes. It's, I think it gave me a lot more empathy for
Mm,
people with bodies that are different from mine and people with bodies that share some of these common features because we are all effectively stuck in these bodies we're in. We're just in them, you know?
yeah.
And some of us have some obvious privilege, some obvious advantage, in the sorts of bodies we're in. And some of us have obvious disadvantages. I am not a disabled person. Many people are. I am a white person in America that actually, well, racism is what it is. And I'm not about to white-splain racism, especially not to you, but it's more one of the things I found really interesting in the menopause chapter was learning about cardiovascular differences across many different human groups in America. So I had to look at sex differences, but sex differences aren't the only thing there shaping the trajectory of your heart and how healthy it is and how quickly it ages. Racism profoundly shapes the trajectory of any given American heart, not just because of, the metaphor of being brokenhearted, but actually the wear and tear of extended drips of cortisol, that the actual fine grit of experiencing social stress over a lifespan, not just what you're eating, not just the stress of where you are, but just literally living in a body that is marginalized in obvious ways, great and small, in America over the course of a lifespan affects not just our mentality, not just our psychology, but our literal cardiovascular systems. And now researchers are finally starting to say, maybe that's part of why this matters. Maybe that's part of why we're seeing so many differences in patients that are from one group or another in the United States, right? So simply seeing those numbers, from a scientific background, seeing those numbers, that you can't argue with and understanding the many different things that shape those numbers obviously changed me, obviously
Mm,
gave me hopefully more empathy. How could you not when you look at the numbers? You know what I mean? But it's also, weirdly enough, it made me hopeful. And you wouldn't think so. You would think I would be depressed as hell looking at all of this data. You know
well,
what
yeah,
I mean?
and
Yeah.
because it feels like we don't have much choice. I mean, the pressures of evolution and the changes that have happened to us, it seemed like we were just buffeted around without the ability to affect it so much.
Absolutely. And I would say over the majority of those 200 million years, yeah. Yeah, we absolutely were. We were very much at fate's, whim. We were just the accident of catastrophe, one after another. But the really cool and amazing thing about being human is that we have language. So we can learn things in ways that no other species can and communicate and share knowledge and build on knowledge. That's a thing that nobody else has got on this planet. But the other thing that we incredibly have is this deeply interconnected set of societies where we are actually capable of understanding exactly how interdependent we are, which means that we can actually make choices that support those social webs. We can actually make choices to make life suck less, knowing more and more and more and more over time, right? Which is to say, what gives me hope after having written this book is both the perspective of deep time, right? To see what trajectories there really are, not just being trapped in the last 50 years, but actually having the perspective of not just 400, not just a few thousand, but 200 million, right? But also saying, oh God, we are learning things about our bodies and our societies that we had no access to even a few decades ago. And we can do things with that knowledge. We can actually improve these objectively terrible lives we often live in these bodies. We can actually help people with this stuff. That makes me incredibly hopeful.
Cat Bohannon. She is the author of Eve, How the Female Body Drove 200 Million Years of Human Evolution. Cat, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us on You Don't Hear That Every Day.
Thank you so much for having me.